Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tlhologelo Mphahlele, and I'll be taking you through a study that I did over the past couple of years. So a little intro into who I am. As I said, I'm Tlhologelo Mphahlele. I work within threat intelligence in one of the local banks, and I got interested in cyber like when I was a kid, when I watched Hackers. I think most of you have watched Hackers, the movie, and the green things come down and you're like, I don't know what this is, but this is for me. And then, yeah, it took me a while to actually get around to understanding what that was. And then a couple of years later, I watched The Matrix, which was more green stuff, and I'm like, I'm sold, where do I sign up, and all of that, right? So because of that, I went into computer science. I'm like, I don't know how to do this, so let me go into computer science. Got into computer science, enjoyed it quite a lot, and I'm like, it still doesn't answer the question, like, where is security? Like, when I did computer science, it was like networking, CCNA. I'm like, where is the security part? And then I did my honors trying to solve that problem, like, okay, let me do more security. In my honors, I focused on security, and then that's where I got sort of bit by the research bug. And then I'm like, I like research, and I also like security, but I don't see myself working in academia. I always felt like it was a little bit removed from what's going on in industry. And within the country, I always felt like industry is here doing very cool stuff. Academia is here doing very cool stuff, but the two worlds don't collide. So I'm like, let me go into the working world and see what's there. So I got into the working world, I did my master's, and then life goes on. And then while at the bank, or where I work as a bank, so I'm like, let me do my PhD. Let me try and bring these two worlds together, and let me try and solve a problem that I felt somewhat passionate about, right? So which led me to my research topic, which was developing a cybersecurity framework for commercial banks, right? So the way the presentation is going to go is that we're going to cover this couple of points. So intro, that's done already. You know who I am and how I ended up here. The problem statement, the theoretical framework, the methodology, the objectives, and results and conclusion. Apologies, this is going to be very academic focused, but I did try and lighten it up and not have a lot of words. I'm going to try and speak through most of what I have to share with you guys, right? So let's first start with the study time frame. So I embarked on this journey in 2020. I'm like, I'm going to do a PhD. I'm going to get the bank to work with me, and I'm going to do this great thing and solve a problem and add another framework to the equation. So 2020 is when I started. If anyone is familiar with the sort of research process, you first have to pitch your idea to people and be like, this is what I want to solve. Is it good enough or not? And luckily it was good enough, and then I started with my study, right? And then in April 2021, I was at a point in my study where now I had to collect data to actually inform what I'm doing and to draw conclusions. And then the rest of the milestones, they are just pretty much other milestones within the research project until I concluded the study last year, right? So let's start with the problems. First things first is that I started my study just as COVID started. So, bad time. People are more concerned about living, which is fair, than they are about my study, right? So that was a huge problem because now I have to get people's attention with all of this. So that's the first challenge that I faced. The second challenge was data collection, right? I work within a bank. My first assumption was that go to a bank, tell them I want to do this. They'll be like, yeah, champ, you can do this. Let's fix this. However, they were like, no, we don't do that here. We don't give out our information. We don't share what's going on within us. So you need to go figure this out. I'm like, okay, maybe it's just my bank. Move on to bank B. Hey, I'm this guy. I have like an ethical certificate to show that I won't mess with your data or anything. I'm like, doesn't sound right. Move on to the next bank. Move on to the next bank. Short stories that all the banks that I talk to are like, look, champ, good idea, good initiative, just not, we don't do that, right? We don't want to share our data with you because we don't know what you'll expose, right? And I try to tell them that, look, I'll be very careful. I'll remove your name. I will do everything. But the flat out answer was like, we don't do that. We're not for that type of initiatives within our organizations, right? So that's okay. I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this externally. I'm going to try and get the data externally. Cool. Move on to the second point. Poppy comes out. Hey, now this is fun. Now I need to send out a survey and people don't want to share details anymore. Because remember, when Poppy came out, everybody was like, I am going to be perfect. I'm not going to share my information and all of this. And people were not sure how it's actually done. So I talked to you. I'm like, hey, can you give me your friend's details who works in banking? And your response is no. Poppy says, I can't do that, right? I'm like, give me something. You're like, no, I can't do that. I talk to other banks, like, is there a mailing list I can use or someone I can talk to who can give me clearance to sort of reach out to people? They're like, no, we can't do that. That sucks. So I'm like, okay, let's move on. Next thing, Cybercrimes Act comes into play, right? Although it came in a little bit later into my study, it also is a span in the works because now I was trying to solve this massive problem, and now the Cybercrimes Act comes in and sort of undoes some of the work I did, right? I'm like, this sucks, what do I do? And at that point, it was too late to pivot, it was too late to go back. I'm like, forward we go, we'll see what we have. And then the last thing, this doesn't really sort of bear any weight on the study itself, but it's just to make people aware if they do have questions that the SARB joint standard came out after the study, and yes, it does address some of the issues that I came across, but I am aware of it, and what was done in the study is that I incorporated parts of the draft bill, which was in the study, right? So now that we got sort of the legal stuff and the external factors out, let's start with the banking landscape in the country, right? We all know of the SARB. We have the SARB, which is big brother of everything, sits on top of all the financial institutions and sort of regulates what they can do, how they perform their actions, and gives out licenses. Then we have the big five banks, Investec, Standard Bank, FNB, Capitec, all of them. Those are the big players. They take up a huge chunk of the market, and they sort of dictate how play goes in the market, right? And then you have your smaller players. For some of you, you're actually not aware, we have I think 20 odd banks in the country. And some of them are very niche, Albaraka Bank being one of them. I'm sure most of you haven't heard of it. Access Bank is also one of them. Grindrod Bank is also one of them. So there's a bunch of banks that exist in our space, but no one actually knows about them or what they do. But they all service a certain client or a certain niche market that they're trying to address, right? So we talk to those. Then we have the digital guys that came in, new banking, new everything. So this is your Discoveries, your Time Bank, your Bank Zero. Although in all honesty, I haven't seen a Bank Zero card, but yeah, we have Bank Zero, we have all those guys. So these make up the banking landscape that we find ourselves in and that the study focused on, right? So the scope of the study was limited to commercial banks. And what I mean by that is that we have other banks in the countries that are not commercial. So Land Bank is actually a legitimate bank in the country, but it's not for me and you. I cannot walk into Land Bank and be like, give me a bank account, I want to transact. We can't do that. So we looked at the commercial banks that we can walk into and sort of transact in, right? And then we looked at previous security incidents within the country, specifically in the banking domain and more so third parties related to banks. So in this case, think about something like TransUnion. It is not in the banking space, but it is very tightly related to banks, right? And then we went into current cyber legislation up until 2021. So this is the joint standard, the draft bill rather, and the Cybercrimes Act and POPI. And then we looked at perception of cybersecurity among employees in the banking sector. So for this, I looked at particularly people in IT. So IT as a broad term, so developers, security people, everyone. And then we looked at GRC consultants, so everybody in governance, risk, and compliance, to sort of build a perception of how do they view security, because the assumption we're basing it on is that they are more close to security rather than someone else who's a bank teller or something like that. Okay. So the problem that we're facing and the problem that sort of led to this is that banks in the country are sort of growing their threat landscape. And what we mean by that is that they're offering more and more of their services digitally, right? If you right now, I don't know, want to apply for a loan, If you go to any bank, mostly they'll be like, sit on the phone, call them, or complete the application on the mobile app, which means that the threat landscape is growing. Attackers can sort of hit them from different angles. So this is one of the problems. The other problem is ineffective deterrence to cybercriminals, right? Before the Cybercrimes Act, there wasn't a lot that could be done to deter criminals. So we're mostly using common law and criminal law to try and get you arrested for hacking, but that really didn't work. You could get away with it, just move your way through it. And then the other issue was a lack of security frameworks for commercial banks, right? So yes, I know there's a lot of frameworks, a dime a dozen for anything, right? You have NIST, IOSCA, you name it, it's there. But all of these frameworks sort of work on the premise that you are a Western country or somewhat from a fairly developed country. You have certain resources at your disposal, and you don't worry about some things, right? Which works if you are in those situations. But if you're in South Africa, how does your security strategy cater for load shedding when your analysts are offline? So that's some of the issues that led to this. Poor legislation and governance in the country. Cybercrime in the country and cyber law is still fragmented. It's still being tackled from a lot of areas, and we don't have a concrete solution for it, right? We used to have the National Cybersecurity Policy Framework, which predates Cybercrimes Act. Then we had Poppy that was trying to do something else to cybercrime. So everyone is trying to come at it from very different angles, and we don't have a unified view, right? Local issues that influence banks. So this is skills. I think Dom spoke about it in the morning. Skills is a huge thing in South Africa, right? Lack of technology awareness, which is also a huge thing also, that banks are operating in an environment where the generation or the people using their apps is so varied. Yes, every country has it, but we literally have people who didn't get the best of education trying to do internet banking. You have people who grew up with technology, who understand it a bit more, and then you have people who don't even understand the concept of banking. Right? So if you talk about new entrants into the market, yes, they understand that we need to do banking, but why should I be using you as a bank? Why can't everything just be, I don't know, like a platform or somewhere up there, and I can just withdraw my money, right? And then the last thing, or the other thing that drove this is increased digital adoption. Like I said, the banks are pushing for a digital-first approach, which means most of their services are only available digitally. And if you go into a bank, they'll direct you to a phone, which doesn't help you much. And then the other issue is the reluctance of information sharing within the cyber community. This was made even more apparent when I tried to gain access into banks to try and do this research, that we're not sharing information. This is the first B-Sides in Joburg, but it's still not enough. Like, how long has B-Sides existed? So the community or sort of the information sharing is not great, and I was trying to figure out how can you solve that and how can you address that. Right? So now that we've sort of painted the problem, we painted the landscape that we're operating in, we look into the research question, right? How can a cybersecurity framework mitigate the cyber threats and attacks within the commercial banks in South Africa, right? So this was more about, if we have a framework, if we're able to come up with a framework, how would this framework be able to assist banks, and how would it be able to address some of the key points that were mentioned in the problem statement? The first assumption I made, or sort of the first concession I made, is that no matter what I come up with, it won't be concrete and it won't be a silver bullet for everything. So I need to just try and move the needle slightly, right? So you move into the research objectives, which was first to analyze the factors that play a role in a successful cyber attack. So what this key point speaks to is that if we look at all the security incidents that we've had in the country, what sort of led them to being successful, right? So one good example is if we look at Standard Bank, Japan. Sorry if there's a Standard Banker in the room. So I'm not picking on you. I'm just saying Japan. We look at Japan. What are the factors that led to Japan? And how was Japan successful, right? We look at that. And then the other thing was, not sure if most of you are aware, there was an incident at Post Bank in Mpumalanga, where people were stealing money from Post Bank, but because Post Bank didn't have the latest and greatest tools, they were sort of succumbing to that, and no one noticed for quite a while. Right. So I was trying to look at those factors, like what is it really that makes us unique and what makes some of the tactics that people are using against us successful. The other thing was evaluating the interventions in place to mitigate attacks within commercial banks. So this is pretty much just looking at tooling, what tooling is out there, what are the banks using, and how are they approaching this problem. So in this case, we're trying to look at it from the three pillars, which is people, technology, and process, right? So from a people perspective, what are they doing? From a process perspective, what are they doing? And from a technology perspective, they have all the money, so they can buy anything they want. That is the assumption I made, right? And then we assess the impact of cyber threats on banks. And the key thing here is a note I said cyber threats, not attacks. So an attack it's already pretty much done. You're either being DDoSed or whatever, or someone is actually carrying out the attack. But a threat is that monkey on your back. It sits there. Whenever you do, you have to think about them. So what is the impact of that? How are banks changing their operating model based on the fact that there's a big bad threat actor out there that could potentially compromise them, right? And then the other one was evaluating the frequency of cyber threats within the financial sector. This was just to get an understanding of what's going on in South Africa and what are some of the challenges we're facing, right? Because prior to this, at least to my knowledge, no one had ever really gone into looking at the threat landscape into South Africa and putting together an academic piece, right? So that was just what we were trying to achieve with that. And then the last one was developing a conceptual framework for commercial banks. Underline conceptual as well. So this is just big picture thinking. This is what the framework would look like, and this is what it would address. Right. So in academia, you have to appease the gods one way or another. And the gods in this case are the research committee that need some sort of backing, like what are you basing your thing on? How are you doing this? So I had to use a framework as a starting point. So in this case, I chose the National Cybersecurity Policy Framework, which was way before Cybercrimes Act, to be like, this is the sort of starting block, this is what we'll be using, right? And then from there, I looked at other theories that will contribute to this study. So systems theory, and the reason I picked systems theory was that we assume security to be a system made up of three parts: people, technology, and process. And all these three interact to do something, right? And then we move on to complexity theory. Complexity theory was just that, how do I bring understanding to a very complicated system, to a very complicated architecture or problem? And security fits the mold because there's a lot to be done in it. And then chaos theory, I liked it because if you Google chaos theory, the first thing you'll see is a butterfly flaps its wings in China, something happens somewhere. So that was pretty cool to me. And what appealed to me was that cybersecurity is similar in that sense. You fix people, you might break technology. You harden your technology, people complain, right? Or something is missing in between, your process is not addressed properly, and that's where the gaps fall through. So those are the three frameworks, that sort of theories that led the study. The boring part is that it used mixed methodology. What that means is just that I did interviews and I did surveys, right? Also, a key thing to note is that many of you in this room did not reply to my LinkedIn requests to do the survey. I recognize some faces. I pleaded with you guys countless times, and and nobody I don't know, but I guess it also speaks to good training, good security training within the companies you work in. They tell you don't click on links. Someone actually replied to my message and was like, my company's filtering your thing saying it's a phishing thing. I'm like, click on it on your personal laptop. He's like, oh, sure, I'll do that. I don't think they ever did. But yeah, that's the thing. Interviews were a little bit easier. People were more willing to talk to you than that. So on the quantitative data side, it's just multivariate data analysis, which is a somewhat complicated way of just saying, use a lot of statistics to try and solve this, right? And the qualitative side, which is the interviews, is thematic analysis. So what that means is that from the conversations that I had with some of the people, what key themes were coming out, right? So what were people saying that, I think I interviewed like 20 people or so, and what are the key things that they were saying that informed the findings, right? So we move on to the recommended conceptual framework, right? So after talking with people, after collecting the data, it came out to these 7 pillars, right? So the 7 pillars all work together to inform a cybersecurity framework, or what could be the building blocks of a really good framework, right? So let's start with cybersecurity resources. Dom spoke about it in the morning, a bunch of people spoke about it as well. We have a resource problem, and not only from people, but also from infrastructure when you look at it locally, right? So you have this vacuum or this shortage of skills that is really affecting South Africa, and there is no direct plug for it. Because currently, students are shying away from STEM fields, which makes it a little bit hard to get people into security, because cybersecurity is a STEM field. So if people don't want to do engineering, science, or whatever, how are we going to plug the gap, right? Second to that, we have a resource problem. So this resource problem that I'm speaking about is infrastructure. Currently, to sort of be a cybersecurity professional, you need to work in one of the major metros where you have Wi-Fi in your area, or be located to a relatively good area where you have fiber or something. So if you're like me and you're from Limpopo, good luck, bro. You're not gonna get a security job, even if it's remote, good luck. Because lightning strikes and then there's no internet for like 3 days. So it's not a joke, it's a real thing. So that's an issue, right? So we have that lack of infrastructure, that's a resource, right? And then the other thing that came up was an alignment of business and security. This has been talked about for years in the security and business space. We all know that there's a misalignment, but the interesting thing during the study that came across was that how much of an issue it was, right? So I would speak to someone in security, like an analyst. I'd be like, okay, what do you think your function is? And they're like, no, my function is to secure the bank. And then I'll speak to someone in business. I'm like, what do you think your function is? Like, no, my function is to generate money. And then when you speak to these two people, they're like, okay, how does cyber come into business? The first thing they say is that business would say cyber is just a blocker. They don't want us to do anything, right? And then you speak to the tech guy, and it's like, business is unreasonable. They want us to have this thing that is shiny and whatever, and if we protect it, we have to remove these things. And now there's a huge mismatch. And then when you also sort of sit down with them and be like, explain what is cyber to you, the business person is like, yeah, it's just hackers and people stealing your money, and that's it, right? You speak to a tech guy, you're like, what is cyber? Interestingly, the answers vary depending on who you're speaking to. If you speak to a developer, most of the time they're like, yeah, cyber is someone hacking you. You just need to make sure that your code is secure practice, yeah, something like that. You speak to an analyst who works in cyber, they'll give you a more fuller answer. So this brought the fact that there's a huge misalignment between what business sees as cyber, what cyber or what technology professionals see as cyber as well. And there's no way we'll ever get to a sort of solidified view if we not speak in the same language within ourselves, within the different departments, between business and security, right? The other pillar is shared intelligence, shared threat intelligence. So there's a lot of initiatives within the country to get this going. I mean, we have the Cybersecurity Hub by the blank stares on you guys. Some of you don't know what that is. It's actually part of the information regulator. They put it out for us to, it's supposed to be the country's SOC. People don't know about it, people aren't using it, people aren't even sure how to go about it, right? And then from there, from shared intelligence, we have Cybric. Cybric is trying to facilitate information sharing within the banks, right? Which is a good thing, but what about everyone else, right? And what if you're a smaller player who perhaps doesn't have anything to share? So this is one of the key pillars that would feed into the framework to solve the cyber issue. We need an open platform. We need something that everyone trusts and they can interact with to solve this huge cyber problem and to sort of make sure that everyone is aware of what's going on in the threat landscape. So, sorry again, but if you're like Access Bank and you're not sure of what the threat actors are doing out there, but someone at ABSA has seen it, if they shared that information, you could protect yourself. And you could sort of reduce the burden needed for you to get an analyst and all of that, right? And then the other top pillar is practical and enforceable legislation. this is a huge, huge issue in South Africa, and I don't know how we're going to solve it. The good thing is that we're making positive strides towards addressing this with the Cybercrimes Act out, with POPI out. But the biggest problem with all of these is that most of them are copy and paste of what's being done in Europe or America or somewhere, right? So POPI is copy and paste of GDPR, took here, talk about South Africa. Cybercrimes Act is also a similar thing. They copied ENISA, I think, and some of the European frameworks. And it's just not going to work, right? Because we have our own challenges. We have our own issues where, firstly, we are, sorry for the term, but we are a third world country with banking systems that are world class. So there's a huge disconnect between those two. So we need to work around that. We need legislation that supports that. We need legislation that addresses that. And the joint standard that came out now is also a good step towards that, right? And the other part of this is enforceable legislation. So if I remember well from the Cybercrimes Act, if you have an incident, a material incident, you're supposed to report it within 72 hours or something like that. If you're a bank, you report it to the sub, which sort of helps. But if I'm person A and someone has hacked my small business, whatever, where do I go? If I go to SAPS, great on you. But you get there and you tell Constable X, like, yo, my website has been hacked, I'm seeing funny things here. I'm pretty sure the constable will be like, good for you, sir.
I've had it where they want to come and take fingerprints. I'm like, what the fuck?
Exactly, right? So,
Cybersecurity, guys, I can't take fucking fingerprints.
Right. So that's the problem, right? So it's not enforceable, right? Because right now also, if you have an incident, what do? Do you physically carry a laptop and put it there and be like, they hacked this thing, do something here? I don't think you'll ever get your laptop back if you did that, right? And then we have three pillars that are tightly coupled together, which is the understanding security part, understanding cyber culture, and cybersecurity awareness. Understanding cybersecurity, this speaks to a general thing of like we need, for commercial banks to come up with a framework that actually works, they need to address what cybersecurity is, right? Example right now, you go to a 50-year-old or 60-year-old, okay, 50 is too young, sorry for 50-year-old, sorry. You go to someone who's 70 years old, they used to do banking like they did. You fill out that deposit slip, you go in, you do all of that, and now you're telling them like, look, sir, you have to download our app. This is the only way you will get money. It's the only way you'll transfer money. If you come into the bank, we will charge you 10 Rand to transfer. Okay? So, and then you tell them that, no, by going digital, you're reducing your footprint and you're doing great for the environment. Just be aware of the hackers. Yeah, great. What do you mean by hackers? What am I supposed to do? So we need to educate people, or the banks need to take a framework that educates even the end consumers, like your granddad and whoever. They need to explain to them, like, look, this is cybersecurity. Treat it just as you would any criminal. Anyone who's trying to steal something, what would you do? Most likely I'd secure my things. And translate that into something that is understandable for people, right? And then we look at cybersecurity culture. What that talks about is that currently cybersecurity it's a stick, right? We tell you that lock your app or the people will steal money. And it's driven from a fear perspective, like do something or something bad will happen. But if we create a positive culture around it, like I said about securing your assets, if you create a positive culture around it, like, no, just as you lock your doors, close your gate, and do this is good security practice. Make sure that you have an OTP on this. What is an OTP? That's a different problem. And then make sure that, no, only certain people have access to your laptop if you're an elderly person or whatever. And just bring that sort of culture into it and make it part of us, right? An interesting thing that came out of the study was that in South Africa, we have a concept of Ubuntu, which means putting someone before you. Weirdly, Ubuntu plays a massive role in cybersecurity in the country, right? Because Uncle Pete called me and said, I need 500 Rand, I've been hijacked. I'm not even sure if it's him, but because of who I am and what I feel is right, I just want to help you. Like, no, like, here you go, here's a 500 Rand. And what we picked up is that from some of the incidents that happen, from some of the interviews that I've had with the people, is that syndicates are abusing that South African thing that I need to help my fellow brother, that I need to help you. And by doing that, it's sort of making it difficult to plug the gap and to change how people do things. We can't change Ubuntu, for sure, but we need to, in a framework that is developed for South Africa, we need to cater for Ubuntu. And we need to ask people, like, we need to, in the framework itself, get people to ask themselves a couple of questions before they do something, right? But not in a scary way. And the other thing is cybersecurity awareness. So it just ties into the other two pillars. We just need to get the word out there. Get security out there, get people understanding what security is, and we need to tackle this thing from a grassroots level. So perhaps it's about time. I remember, maybe it's not that long ago, but when I was in school, banks would come in to be like, this is how you deposit money. They'd give you like a little slip that you write on. They're like, oh, this is how money works. This is how you deposit money. This is how we withdraw money. You fill out the withdrawal receipt. Perhaps it's time that a framework for South Africa would incorporate that. How do we go down to the lowest level? Maybe we can't help the older generation, but we can help the younger generation that lives with the older generation to be like, no, if your mom wants to do this on their phone, they should probably first check this, or they should make sure that they're not running some weird malware thing on their phone. And if we drive that education in at the sort of grassroots low level, perhaps we could resolve this issue. And perhaps if you take all these 7 sort of pillars and feed them into one thing, we come up with a framework. So the whole thing is, we have different challenges. We have very unique problems in South Africa. And a cybersecurity framework that is going to work in the country needs to address these 7 pillars, from my study anyway, from what I found. And once we address these 7 pillars, we'll have a pretty solid bedrock of what's next. What do we do? How do we then move from the Cybercrimes Act to perhaps NIST? I don't know, we can't call it NIST, but IST something, Africa Information something. But how do we move to a platform or to a framework that is catered for us, for our different problems, for our challenges, and for the different sort of little nuances that exist in South Africa? Right. So to wrap it up, the first thing to note is that we are making positive steps towards a harmonized cybersecurity framework. Yes, most of us have a problem with the Cybercrimes Act. Yes, most of us have a problem with the POPI Act, but we have to give credit where credit is due. It is the right step. We're going somewhere, right? And now we also need to sort of get involved and get our voices heard. The second thing I just want to highlight is that there is a place for academia in cybersecurity in South Africa. Currently, during my study, and as I feel very passionate about it, the 2 worlds exist sort of in parallel. And that doesn't make sense if one can inform the other and one can sort of, I don't know, act on something. If we were able to get these 2 worlds closer to each other, if we were able to take real business problems and present them to varsity students, not CTFs. CTFs are great, but they're not addressing the problem. Go there, tell them to spin up an Active Directory environment, tell them that this is what we're facing. Yes, they might not be able to solve it, but they might come up with a completely different way of thinking about it. Or they might give you a perspective that you haven't thought about. And by doing this, you also make sure that the talent coming in is employable because they now know practical tools. And we're also investing into the whole security sort of circle, right? We're making sure that everyone is aware of security, and we're also making sure that the business or the banks themselves are making the best of the skills that we have in the country. So that is me. The QR code on this presentation is a link to the full research paper for those who are interested. It's quite a lengthy document, sorry. But that's how it goes. So if you're interested, you can read the full paper. I did sort of gloss over some of the key things that are in the paper, so you're more than welcome to go through it. So yeah, thank you. Oops. Any questions? Yeah, sure.
I've also done similar research on mobile applications for a secure software development framework, and I've also identified the major concern is companies don't, and especially banks, I also work for a bank, they don't talk to each other. And yes, Saab and Sabric is there or are there, but still the companies don't say if we have been hacked, that kind of thing. We all want to keep everything to ourselves until it's legislation and you're going to be fined if you don't say what's going on. So let's fight the cybercrime together, and the banks need to differ. Well, not especially banks, but every company almost. So that they differ on the features that they provide, that value-added service. So let's fight this crime together, and let's separate our work based upon our features. But yeah, that point that you made there, what was it, practical and enforceable, that's definitely almost my number one. Else is going to go out the wall, and every company is going to do their own thing, and they need to talk.
Yeah, no, for sure. They need to talk more. I know that they are talking, but exactly, they are talking. And some of the talks happen in Telegram channels that are not for everyone, but that's still not open enough, right? Some people, if you're not in part of those Telegram channels, you're obviously missing out, right? And we need legislation that's going to force them, although we do have it right now, but I feel like because there aren't heavy penalties, maybe they're not doing that. They're not actively working on sharing and actively working on a platform where to exchange information. But yeah, what you said is spot on. Thanks. Any other questions? Yeah, sure. Oh, sorry, this one there.
Okay, I get that the way we do things now and the way they did things back then are so different because times are moving. But looking at how we do things now and how they do things back then, which is in the banking sector, which one would you say it's more severe and why?
I wouldn't say there's a safer version. Is that what you're asking, right? Yeah. I wouldn't say there's a safer version. I would say, so the benefit of how they did it back then when you fill out stuff and you go into the physical bank is that they sort of verify you in person, right? They know who you are. They transact based on the fact that they've identified who you are. So that's great, but we also can't stick to that because then we're not innovating, right? The problem with this way that we're going now is that, and it's horrible to say, banks are closing down branches. Great, but what about the people who actually rely on the branches, right? What about like people in remote areas that need to go in to do something? So there isn't like a safe way. It's just we need to have an inclusive way, right? Cater for both. Maybe as morbid as it is, maybe wait for the older generation to die before you close the branches. Maybe, I'm just saying, maybe do that. But there isn't a safer way. Both need to exist within the same space. Right. This hand, yeah.
Cool, man. Thanks for the talk. Quite interesting. My question is, quite interesting. If you considered maybe testing the framework within your current environment, because it's one thing developing a framework, it's one thing testing its efficacy to see how well does it apply to the environment that you initially targeted it for, right?
Yeah, so that's where the problem comes in as well. Currently, banks are not pro-external research. How do you bring that in, right? Because then they assume that obviously I'm going to have findings. I'm going to come in and be like, yeah, my framework doesn't really work great. I need to tweak this, I need to tweak this, which is great. But then I need to also put out that piece of information that it failed in these areas because of this. And the reason I said it over a couple of times that it's a conceptual framework because testing it is quite difficult within the banking space. They're very closed. They don't want to share anything. And an interesting thing is that when I was doing this research, and it's just what I found, I only found one white paper regarding security. From all the banks, only one bank published a white paper. How is that possible? So if we could have a more open or more sort of, that's why also the last point is that the two worlds need to come together. Academia and industry need to come together because I can't solve pie in the sky problems while we have real problems, right? So yeah. I don't know if this one here and then.
How's it?
Yeah.
So I wanted to find out, yes, we're looking at the frameworks and everything that has to be custom made for the banking in South Africa. Does that have to, in a way, speak to also the tooling that the banks use? Have you looked at anything that has to do with maybe designing our own tools that would actually speak to our environment in South Africa or in Africa as a whole?
Yeah, so from a tooling perspective, right, obviously homegrown solutions are best, but the study didn't look at that. The study made the assumption that banks have money to buy the tools, the latest and greatest tools. But obviously if you develop local tools, maybe some of those tools will help. But it was just a baseline assumption that they have the money to buy the best tools out there and let them do so. Yeah.
Well, I've got a question. It's just a follow-up to, it's sort of related to his question. I walked in a bit late, so I might have missed some details, but have you validated this elsewhere apart from the banking sector? And where I'm coming from with that is, I love how you're trying to connect academia to this framework, right? From my experiences, I'm from Zambia.
Okay. Yeah.
One of the things that I've noticed is the banks in Zambia don't talk as well. They don't share when bad things happen in their environment. And that's a tough conversation to bring up with the banks. And just listening to you, I think it's the same problem in South Africa as well. One of the things that I've been thinking about, because I'm also a huge advocate of a framework like yours, and I think Zambia also needs it, Africa needs it, right? One of the things that we've tried, and we've seen that it might have a positive traction, is talking to universities and similar institutions, because they get attacked as well. But those ones are a little bit more keen to have this threat intelligence sharing possibility, so to speak, right? So my question then is, have you tried to validate it in environments like universities or similar institutions? If yes, what's been the outcome? If no, is it something that you would want to maybe consider?
The short answer is no. Obviously, given a scope of a study, it has to cover something. The short answer is no. But I would be very interested in trying it out somewhere, right? In academia or even in SMEs. I think in the country we have a lot of small companies or small medium enterprises that are moving into the digital space. It would be very interesting to try and validate that in that space and see what findings we can get, and perhaps that would then sort of go up to more established industries where they would want it. But yeah, it'd be very interesting to try that.
Sounds good. Yeah, I mean, and just a follow-up comment to that, please try it out and let me know how it goes. I'll keep in touch with you. But I still think if institutions like universities jump onto a framework like this and it proves to work, I kind of feel like maybe the banks would be a little bit more open because they've seen a prototype work and they've seen that there's an outcome out of the collaboration, right? So I tend to think that maybe that could be a viable approach to, first of all, try out the framework, but then also help with changing mindsets, especially in the banking sector.
Yeah,
thanks.
For sure. Thanks a lot. Last question.
Okay, yes. So even if we do implement all the checks and balances and all the security requirements, what we've seen, well, almost in not just the banking industry but everywhere around, we're gonna close all the doors, and the only door that's going to be open is the hijacking door.
Okay.
Honestly, because not just on the banking sector, we can implement all these tools to secure the mobile app, to secure the computer, to secure everything, But if the society that we live in, and your framework probably, or maybe research after this as well, into what can we do with SAPs or Secret Service or that kind of thing to introduce those kind of integration methods.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm out of time, but an interesting thing that someone said during the study was that maybe if I go to the bank, let's say in the hijacking situation that you're giving, if I go to an ATM under duress and I put in my card, and if I type my PIN backwards, maybe that sends a message to SAPS to be like, this guy's being forced to withdraw money under duress. But the problem is that how long is that going to take them to get there? It doesn't work, yeah. But okay, thanks everyone. That's all.